In this video, we're going to start exposure blending, and we're going to start with simple exposures. So you'll find some images that come with this video. So first of all, can you load these ones in, please, and then start following along in the tutorial. Every time I do something, feel free to press pause to copy what I did and then press play again. You don't have to follow along exactly as I do. That would probably be a little bit difficult. Now, the first thing we need to do is to stack our images. You see they're open here as two separate windows. And we want to put them as layers in one window. So a simple way to do that is just to press stack. And this is on the Raya Pro 3 hub. And now we've stacked our images. Now I want to zoom into my images or make it full size on the screen. So I'm going to press Control and 0 or Command and 0. And now we have our base exposure here on top. And I'm going to take my base exposure and drag it to the bottom because we always have our base exposure as the bottom layer. Then we have our dark exposure on top. And if we're working with a third exposure, be it a darker exposure or a brighter exposure, we always put those on top. So the order I do things is base exposure, dark exposure, and then an even darker exposure or the brightest exposure. And you'll see more of that later. Now in this image, we want to recover some of the highlights, not all of them, just some of them. So we're going to paint in using luminosity masks, things like this area here, that area there, and the base along here. But we don't want to dull the city. We want the city lights to be nice and vibrant. We just want to restore some information. So to do that, as you've already seen, we need to keep our dark exposure invisible. So we could press hide layer, and that makes it invisible. Now we want to select these areas here in this building and the brightest areas in the city. And also we have to look at the reflection too down here. So if we press a bright one mask, you'll notice that that isn't contrasting enough. We do have these areas which are nice and bright, but the areas in the sky and the buildings around that we don't want to affect are simply too bright. We need these areas to be a darker grey or black. So we can go to a Brights 2, and that gives us a much better selection. We could possibly even use a Brights 3, and I think in this example that would work pretty well because we've got a good selection of this board here and this board here, and we haven't selected any of the areas around these buildings or these boards. If we feel like it's a little bit too contrasting, we can always bring down these midtones just to soften the mask a little bit. But if we want to make this area wider, then we can bring along the highlights. So you can adopt the mask any way you see fit. Right now, I think this looks okay, but I'm not 100% sure. So I want to test the mask. I choose the dark exposure and I can press test. Now I make that visible and I think that looks okay. So we're looking at these areas here, this area up here. We've got some chromatic aberration because I haven't cleaned that in the base exposure. So I apologize for that. I just converted my raw files straight to JPEG, and that's why we have this chromatic aberration without cleaning it. But I'll show you how to prepare and clean your images for exposure blending later on in the tutorial. So if we just ignore the chromatic aberration for now, I can zoom out. And in fact, that area, while that has been clearly brought back, it looks like there isn't really much information in that area in the first place. So if I disable the mask, you see that was already overexposed in the darker exposure. So we can leave that for now. And essentially, I think that is probably a good selection. What we really want to do is bring back this area here, and this area down here, which is too bright in the bright exposure. So if we think this mask is going to do a good job, we can press End Test. So we return to our Instamask. We can press Select, and we've made an active selection. Black mask. Then we can hide the ants, and if your dark layer isn't visible, choose Show Layer. And now we need a white brush, and I'm going to make it a little bit smaller, let's say around 700 pixels. And I'm just going to paint in that darker exposure here. And then I can paint it in there too. And now here, where it's a little bit too bright. And now if I think I've darkened that too much, I can undo it, change my brush opacity to 50%, and I can do that by pressing the number 5 key on my keyboard. And there we go, we just bring in some of those highlights, not too much. So I'm just dotting around here in the city where I think it looks a little bit too bright. There we go. And I'm going to change that back to 100% opacity just so we can bring back some of the other highlights that might be a little bit too distracting, like these street lights. And this thing up here, and maybe paint this down here, and possibly at the top of this building also. So now if I feel like I'm done, I can press deselect, and that will deselect the active selection. And if I zoom in, we can see the before and after. So we've brought back that nice information there in the big sign. We've also brought some information back in that lettering there on the building. What about this big thing up here? Before and after. So we've recovered all of those overexposed areas. And what if we go down here, which was a little bit too bright before? There we go. We've recovered some of that information. So that's a really simple way to blend two exposures using luminosity masks in Instamask. Now let's look at our next example. Here we have another cityscape, this time of Dubai, whereas the last one was of Hong Kong. Now I'm going to stack these again so they're as layers in Photoshop. And just as before, I take my base exposure and I put it at the bottom. Now I want to use my base exposure because it's bright and vibrant and I love these light trails down here. So if I use Instamask and let's say I want to select the brightest highlights in the base exposure and I go to a Brights 2 for example, the reason I'm not simply pressing apply is because it flattens some of the image. And you see, look at those light trails that we have in this base exposure. They're nice and vibrant and bright, and now they've been darkened and they look kind of inconsistent, and I don't really want that in this image. So that's why it's better to use luminosity masks in these examples so I can target specific areas that I want to recover. So I'm going to delete that mask and I'm going to generate a luminosity mask. I'm going to hide this layer and you see we have overexposed areas here, here, and at the top here to the left on this part of the building. So let's say those are the only areas that I want to recover, and possibly some areas down here like these bright lights and maybe something on street level as well. Well, just as before, I have my darker exposure invisible. I create, let's say, a Brights 2 mask, or we can change that to a Brights 3 mask, which is more contrasting. Again, I can press select, choose a black mask, hide my ants, make sure I've got a white brush selected, and show that layer to make sure my dark layer is visible. And now, with a bigger brush, I can just paint in this previously overexposed area. And look how we're not going into the sky, we're just keeping our selection in the overexposed area. And let's zoom into this area too, and with a white paintbrush, I just press it once, and now we've recovered this area really quickly. What about this building site down here? If I press it once, we've recovered that building site. I press it again, I make that an even stronger selection. Now in the shop front here down the bottom, we can bring back some of that information. And remember, we can press the mouse button a few times, going over it a few times to strengthen the effect. We're not limited to just one press of the button. So I'm just restoring some of this information in the foreground. And there you go. So if we zoom out, I can press Command and D or Control and D to deselect the active selection, or I can press deselect. And now there's the before and after. Look at this area. This has got much more information than it did before. This area too. Very nice blend. Down here at the building site also, it's a little bit blurry because it's quite far away. And we've even pulled back some information in this building here too. So those are two examples of how we'd use luminosity masks to restore specific highlights. But what about restoring shadows? Let's go to our next example where we're going to pull shadows from a brighter exposure and put them into a base exposure. So here we have two images which are waterfall images from New Zealand, and if I press stack, I'll put them as layers again. And this time, as always, I put my base exposure at the bottom. Remember that a base exposure is the exposure you would consider to be the best exposure. So if you only had one exposure to work with, this would be it. So that's why I haven't chosen this as my base exposure. It's simply too bright. There's not enough information in there, whereas here, we could actually do quite a lot with that individual raw file. But I want to use this brighter exposure just to restore some of these darker areas in the base exposure. You see we've got underexposed areas throughout, to the left here with these trees and on the rocks, and I want to restore some of that information. I don't want to bring it back completely because we need shadows to help deepen the mood in our images. So I'm just going to bring those underexposed areas back a little bit. Now if I create a mask on this bright exposure, it's too bright to give us a great mask. So if I open up Instamask and I press Darks 1, for example, or if I want to be more specific, let's go for a Darks 2, so we're not affecting any midtones. And I press Select, Black Mask, and I hide the marching ants, and I've got a white brush, and I'm going to make it a large brush. Watch what happens when I paint in this area. It looks kind of flat. It doesn't look very good, does it? So if I make this mask invisible, you see these leaves should have a little bit of vibrancy to them, a little bit of texture. But with that mask, they're flat, and it doesn't look very good at all. So I'm going to deselect that, delete the mask, and start again. And I'm going to generate the mask on our base exposure because this has a lot more shadows to work with when generating our masks. So if we create a Darks 1 mask, you see that's much more encompassing than our bright exposure. But if we go down to, let's say, a Darks 2, and that's still selecting a lot of information. So what about a Brights 3? That's a lot more specific. I'm going to target this even more. Remember, I just want this to affect the dark shadows in the image, and that's it. So here we've got the underside of this rock here, and these trees. But I don't want to affect anything, say, along here or along the foreground here. So if we look at the mask, we can see the foreground hasn't been selected and nor have the areas around there. So if I'm happy with that, I can press Select, choose my black mask just as we've done before, show this layer, hide the marching ants, choose a white brush, and I'm going to make that brush a little bit smaller, and I'm going to paint in those shadowy areas. You see we're slowly bringing them back. And I'm going to make a smaller brush and bring back some of the areas under there too, and here. And I'm just going to keep going over those shadowy areas. Now I'm actually going to bring down the opacity of this layer significantly. So it's okay if the blending doesn't look particularly natural right now. I'm just going to bring back some of those trees, maybe a little bit more. Remember, we can go over this a few times to strengthen the effect. And then I'm going to press Command and D or Control and D to deselect that active selection. And I'm going to bring the opacity down. So we don't have anywhere near as much information in those areas as before. They were just a little bit too bright. And now I'm going to choose that mask. And I actually think that I painted in too much of these trees. So I'm going to paint out these trees at about 30% brush opacity. And these rocks here. Because having these dark, it's good to have some information there, but they create a beautiful little vignette in the top corner, just as we've got a slight vignette with this darker water here. And we have some darker areas here which also act as a vignette. So we're kind of framing the image. And if I make that too bright, it creates an imbalance in that frame. So here is a quick before and after from the exposure blending. So we've brought back some useful information into those darker areas. Now I just want to show you one cool thing that we have in Raya Pro 3 that isn't related to exposure blending. If you've just blended your exposures and they're looking a little bit flat, you haven't added any contrast or done anything else, we can go to the Filters and Finish tab, and scenes like this really benefit from one of my filters, and it's called Magic Green Lands, and it's definitely the most popular filter around for landscape photographers who use Raya Pro. So if I just press Magic Green Lands, and then we'll get this dialog which pops up, and this is for our Orton effect, and I'm just going to leave it at around 35, 36 and press OK. And then I'm going to let Raya Pro 3 do its work. It's got quite a lot to do, so it might take it a few seconds. Then I'm going to close this panel and I'm going to open up Magic Green Lands. And now I think it's a little bit too green, so I'm going to go to Boost to Greens and bring that down. And there's another one here which says greens, and I'm going to bring that down too, because it's already a little bit too green. Then I'm going to go to Auto Effect, and I'm going to bring the opacity of that down just to around 60%, let's say. There's the before and after, just so it's still got a really cool Lord of the Rings type feel to it. And I might even bring down the Brights Boost option. Yeah, I'll make that invisible because it's overexposing the water too much. So we've got complete control over this filter and the individual elements within the filter. But if I close the folder, here's before we add Magic Greenlands and here's after. And it adds a lovely kick, a lovely bit of contrast. It's still kept information in our darker areas because it has things like protect shadows here. So if we zoom into these areas, you can see the information is still in there, even though it's quite dark. And if you zoom into here, you see we've still got some great information in there. So it hasn't underexposed our image, and it's left us with a really good final product. So now I want to take you through one more image, and it's going to show you how to blend 3 exposures. And it's an image we've already seen in previous videos, but now you get a chance to work on it yourself. So we're going to be exposure blending the Mesa Arch images we saw earlier. And I'm going to press stack to put them as layers, and here we have our 3 exposures. Now to blend 3 exposures, as I explained earlier, we put the base exposure at the bottom. We put the brightest exposure on top and the darkest exposure in the middle. And now we simply keep these invisible. So I want to build a mask around the base exposure because that gives us a great selection of the sky for the darker exposure. So I want to take the darker exposure sky and put it right into that base exposure. But if I build a mask around this darker exposure, watch what happens. I press Brights 1 and look at how grey the sky is. We want the sky to be white because that's the area we want to select. But here it's light grey. If, however, I make this darker exposure invisible and press Brights 1 again, look at how much whiter the sky is with just some parts that are grey now. So with that in mind, I'm going to bring this slider along and I want to make the sky a little bit whiter and the foreground a little bit darker. I don't want all of the foreground to be completely black. Dark grey to black is fine. So with this selection, you see we've got the sky which is perfectly white, apart from some areas which we can brush out soon. We've eliminated the foreground from the selection because it's nice and dark. So if I press select, hide marching ants, black mask, show the layer, choose a white brush at 100% opacity. So I press 0 on my keyboard to make the brush opacity 100%. And then I just paint this area. Here we are blending the exposures beautifully. And I'm going to go over the sky again, especially up here. You see we brought back the clouds because we can go over with luminosity masks multiple times. Now look at the beautiful blending in the horizon here. Look at that smooth transition. We couldn't do that without luminosity masks, without that beautiful white to grey, to darker grey and then to black transition. It gives us a really smooth mix of both exposures so it looks completely natural. And now we want to blend the brighter exposure into the base exposure. Now in this example, we probably could build a mask around the brighter exposure. You see it's not incredibly bright. We still have some shadows and darker areas to work with. But let's stick with the same rule I suggested earlier. If we make this brighter exposure invisible and we create a dark swan mask, see we've got a really good selection of the foreground. Now when it comes to blending in brighter exposures into a base exposure, I like to have the mask as general as possible. Naturally, we don't want any of the sky in here, so we want to try and remove that from the horizon. But we want the foreground to be as white as possible, rather than going for a really contrasting mask like a Darks 4 or a Darks 3. Because in this example, we want to take most of the foreground from the brighter exposure and put it into the base exposure. Let's say, for example, I did choose a Darks 5, which is a really targeted, restrictive mask, which is very useful for some images, but not for this image. And I press select, and of course I create a black mask. I show that layer, I hide the ants, and we've got a white brush selected. Watch what happens. I'm brushing in the foreground, but it's kind of flattening the contrast in the foreground. And that's because we're bringing through the darkest parts of the image of that brighter exposure and putting them into the base exposure. So we're essentially equalizing the contrast in the darker tones. And that's what we want to avoid. So I'm going to deselect that selection and I'm going to delete that mask, make this brighter exposure invisible again. And I'm going to use a Darks 1 mask, but I'm going to bring along the shadow slider, maybe even the mid-tone slider, just to eliminate some of the sky there on the horizon. Then if I press select, black mask, hide the layer, hide marching ants, and choose a white paintbrush, and sorry, I was supposed to show the layer, not hide the layer, I can now begin to paint in the brighter exposure. And you'll see it brightens up much of the image. Now I'm going to make the darker exposure visible here. I'm going to press Command and D and Control and D to deselect the active selection. And then I'm going to bring down the opacity of the brighter exposure. You'll see it's just too bright to go with this sky and this foreground. This is one of the most important points when exposure blending, when we're trying to determine the balance of light in our scene. We have to ask ourselves, are the darker parts of our image too bright compared to the brighter parts? Is the luminosity of the entire image natural to the eye? For example, if we bring up the opacity of this brighter exposure, look how bright the foreground is. It's much brighter than the sky, for example, and it doesn't feel right. Not only does it suck out all of the mood from the image, it just doesn't logically make sense to us. So if I bring that opacity down, we still have plenty of useful information in the foreground. We're not underexposing any areas. We're just creating an accurate balance in the image, but we're also deepening the mood because we've got a lovely darker foreground now. So that's before and after. And just to compare the before and after for exposure blending, here's the base exposure and here's the final result. And so this is a really balanced image that's nicely blended and looks very natural to the eye. So that's how we can blend simple exposures. Oftentimes we'll pull our images into Photoshop, we'll add a couple of masks, and it will blend together naturally without any problems. But a lot of the time we're not that lucky. Sometimes the scene that we've been shooting is a little bit more difficult than what we anticipated. So in the next videos, I'm going to show you some more advanced post-processing when it comes to exposure blending. And these are processes called pre-masking and matching. And they're both really important for clean exposure blending, especially matching. So I suggest you watch those videos a few times to get a hang of it and to try the process with your images too.